In this week's video, we're going to be painting some Ultramarines Terminators. As always, any questions or queries, make sure you leave them in the comments below and hit the like button if you do enjoy it. Here we go. To start off with, Games Workshop Mechanicus Standard Grey, thin it down to a wash consistency and then remove the excess off of the brush. The Terminator heads are painted, base coated in Vallejo Game Color Ghost Grey, and what we're going to do is we're just going to add some variation here. So in the area underneath the cheekbone and on the side of the head, we're going to push in a little bit of a shadow. We're doing this with super thin paint, like we said. Remove the excess so you don't have a huge amount. It doesn't take a lot to tint the white. You just want to add some depth to the paintwork. Then what we're going to do is with Vallejo model color white, or any white that works for you, we're going to edge highlight every edge on the Terminator helmet. These have got such strong angles on them that we really want to make it as readable as possible. So that's why we're placing in an edge highlight. The white looks a little bit over the top early on. Don't worry about that. It's going to die down. Like, we're going to knock it back with some washes later on and some weathering. So don't panic too much. The priority is, remember, the #1 rule with miniature painting is readability. So the priority is here. We want to get a nice readable shape for the Terminator head. I am painting 10 of these at the same time, so you can see the other Terminator head on the other side, but this is basically the test model for the army. Next up, what we want to do, again, we're prioritizing readability at this point. Games Workshop Mechanicus Standard Grey, we're painting it into the recesses nice and neatly. If you do struggle with this, I get it. Like, painting lines is really, really hard. Just get a nice recess wash. Something like, I think Nuln Oil would be a little bit too much, but a nice, maybe a mix between Games Workshop Drachenhoof Nightshade and Nuln Oil could be quite nice. I'm just painting it in. But again, the priority here is what we want to do is dark line these recesses so all of those shapes are really, really popping. Again, like always the same thing. Readability is the most important thing. Don't worry too much if it looks a little bit messy at the beginning. We've got a lot of work to do over the top of this. I'm spending a lot more time on the helmets than I probably need to, but the thing is with Ultramarines Terminators, because the Ultramarines are obviously blue and the helmets are white, the helmets are really, really important because they stand out so much. So in this case, what we're doing is we're really spending a lot more time on them because we want them to pop. We want them to stand out because they're the focal point. If you make any mess, go back in with the Vallejo Game Color Ghost Grey and just clean it up. The idea with this is everyone's going to look at the helmets. They're going to be their best part. Now, with all of the rest of it, I want a nice dark metallic, right? This is something that basically, if I have a nice dark metallic, when I put my nice edge highlights on, those edge highlights are really going to pop. So if I place my metallic paint over this white, that metallic's not going to be as dark as I want it to be. So any areas right now that I want to place a silver over the top, I'm going to black out. So nice and simple, this is AK Interactive Black. I'm blacking out any areas that I want as a metallic, and I'm also doing the lenses because I want a nice dark foundation for when I paint the eyes. Any black you want to use is absolutely fine. AK is just my preferred black at the moment. Once you've got all the black down, Scale 75 Black Metal, we're going to base coat all of the metallics in it. Scale 75 Black Metal is, the Scale 75 metallics just behave really, really nicely, which is why I quite like them. And Black Metal is a really dark silver, which means those highlights are going to pop. Now, you don't have to use Scale 75, it's just a preference of mine. Any metallics that you're happy with will be absolutely fine. Just try not to put a big blob of it on the white like I just did. Pro Painter and all that. Wow. Once you've done that, it's just a case of placing in your edge highlights. I've used Scale 75 Heavy Metal, so you can see this is a nice bright silver. If you're not too comfy with painting the lines, you can just do like a dry brush and it will do the job nearly as well. I wanted more striking lines. I wanted it to look a lot more like sharper. So I decided to basically edge highlight all of them, but a dry brush would be just as good. It'll give you a slightly different result is all. And also, if you do a dry brush, potentially it's going to go over the white. You've got to be a lot more careful about it. So for all intents and purposes, any of the silver on this model, because I'm not going to show you it again on the blue, any of the silver on this model is Scale 75 Black Metal over a black base coat with Scale 75 Heavy Metal as the edge highlight to make it pop. Nice and simple. If you want to add some color to it, you can add some inks and washes of like blues and greens and yellows and that sort of stuff, and it will give it a nice tint, but you don't need to do any more than this. Now, the eyes were quite difficult to paint, I'm not going to lie. So when it comes to the eyes, there's a couple of points where it goes off camera and I apologize. We're going to go over the black with AK Interactive Dark Prussian Blue. The Dark Prussian Blue is going to be incredibly dark. The idea is I want the darkest color to be blue, not black. It's just a preference. If you want, you can leave them black. You do you. I'm just not a fan of true black on a model unless it's really, really in the recesses because I find it looks quite unnatural. From that AK Dark Prussian Blue, we're going to layer in a bit of Games Workshop Hoeth Blue. The idea with this is towards the center of the face, so towards the nose, this eye lens is going to get brighter and brighter. It's going to get closer and closer to white, and you can see me painting it in here. And again, apologies, most of it is on camera. It should be good enough for you to see, but the idea is we're blending towards the inside of the face to the Hoeth Blue. So we've got this nice gradient from AK Interactive Dark Prussian Blue all the way up to Hoeth Blue, and then we're adding increments of white into the Hoeth Blue to make it brighter and brighter. If you can do it, a nice line along the bottom of the lens, like you can see, is also really nice, and it will help frame the eye. I appreciate this is quite challenging, so you don't have to. Just the gradient itself will make a big difference. I'm pushing almost to a white here, and you can see how that eye lens really starts to pop now. I know it's challenging, it's really, really difficult, but again, when it comes to the helmets of your models or the faces, this is where we want to spend a lot of time. We want to spend the majority of our time. To get the reflection, to get the illusion of the reflection, what we want to do is we just want to get some white on our brush. In my case, I'm using Vallejo Model Color White because I find it's really, really opaque while it's still fluid. And we're going to put 1 or 2 dots on the lens. And you can see here, it's not easy. I've got to go over it a couple of times. Make sure you use a good brush. Like, you're setting yourself up to fail if you're using a bad brush like me. So use a nice brush, get a nice dot in, maybe 2, in that dark corner, and then the illusion will start to come in. And if you really want to push it, you can actually push a white dot into the corner of the lens by the nose as well, and really make it shine. If this was a display piece, I probably wouldn't put gloss varnish over it. As it's an army piece, absolutely. Get some gloss varnish over the top of it, just to help with the illusion. There's nothing wrong with that. Next up, with these Terminators, when the Terminators were sent over to us, there was a few bits of damage on the models themselves. The client knew this, and what we decided to do was basically hide that damage in some weathering. So this army does have to have some. So in this case, Games Workshop Rhinox Hide, this particular Terminator helmet had a mark that went all the way along the center of this face. So I've got some Rhinox Hide, and what I'm doing is I'm adding on some dots and marks. This gives us the illusion that there are chips of paint out of the face. That cut that's going across all the way across the head, it's a little bit too extreme for what I would normally do, but that was one piece of damage that was actually on the model that we had to kind of hide. So we went a little bit more pronounced than we probably would. But there's nothing wrong with some weathering on a model anyway. Just be careful with weathering. If you do too much chipping, it can be very quickly become quite overpowering. And if in an ideal situation, I would have done a lot less on the head. But this is one of the heads that we've painted on the blue armor. So you can see like the white really, really stands out. The chipping isn't too overpowering. And you can see we got lots of different marks and different amounts of chipping on the face. The weathering on the faces is actually a lot more prominent because it's basically Rhinox Hide, a really dark color over the white. When we do it on the blue Terminator armor, it's going to be far more subtle. So again, like spend lots of time on the helmets, really, really makes the models pop, and it can have a really big impact on the army as a whole. Now, as for the blue armor, we want to keep this nice and simple. We're going to have a lot of blue to do on this army. So we're going to start with the Zenithal Prime. We are using an airbrush. You've seen in the other videos, you can use a paintbrush if you want. This is a black base coated model. We've got a Vallejo Game Air. I'll get my words out. We get a Vallejo Game Air, and we're basically priming the model from above, and we're pushing it all the way to white. Nice and straightforward. Basically what you want to get is you want to get a rough gradient from black up to white, and then this is going to tint everything you put over the top. So we're trying to keep this as simple as possible. So you can see the top, you can see how the paint is coming down from the top of the model, and I'm trying to paint so we're retaining as much of that black as possible, because we need the dark to make the blue look nice and rich. So this is really important. Keep it nice and straightforward. Same as usual with the airbrush, 1 part paint, 1 part flow improver, and 1 part water. Once you've got all of this down, you can see that I'm doing a lot of these all at once, so I'm proper batch painting these. Once you've got all of these down, you can move on to the blue. The blue is basically scale 75 Inktensity Cyan. So we're painting with a pure ink here. Same again, we're going to thin it down, 1 part flow improver, 1 part water, 1 part ink. And the idea is we're going to go over with super thin layers of paint, and basically we're going to keep tinting this until we get the nice blue that we like. Now, something to think about with these inks, in my experience, the scale 75 inks tend to be quite inconsistent with their strength. So some of my scale 75 inks are more opaque than others and require more thinning than others. So what I would suggest is, if you're using these paints, you want to thin this down to a glazed consistency of paint. You want to thin it down so it's semi-transparent. And then we're building up multiple layers, and we're just covering the whole model. We're letting the zenithal prime do the work for us. And this has taken, it probably takes 5 or 6 coats. But when you're painting 10 Terminators or 30 Space Marines or 3 tanks and you're doing it all in one go, it's actually incredibly time efficient. You'll also see that I've got a hairdryer. So I'm doing my layer of scale 75 Inktensity Cyan. I'm drying it with the hairdryer, and then I'm going in and doing another coat. Now at the moment you can see me doing 1 model. The reality is I'm actually doing 10 models all at once, and you can see that I'm jumping between them. So I'll do a layer on one, and then I'll go to the next one, do the layer, do the next one, do the layer, and I'll go through all 10. I'll make sure they're dry with a hairdryer, and then I'll start all over again. And in truth, the zenithal prime took me about 5 to 10 minutes to get all of the black and white down, and then the blue took me about 20 minutes. So half an hour to get a nice blue across the whole models, across the models. I really can't get my words out today. I apologize. Half an hour to get the blue down on all 10 of these Terminators is really not a big deal, and I think the result is quite nice. Now previously, when we started painting the silver, I painted black down first, so the silver had a nice dark foundation. When we're putting the black metal down, so this is once again scale 75 black metal, once we put that black metal down this time, I'm not painting black first. And the reason for that is this blue is quite dark, so there's just no point. The blue is dark enough to give us a nice dark foundation to it, so just lay down the black metal for all of the silver, and then I'm not going to show you it again, but edge highlight or dry brush the scale 75 heavy metal, and you'll get a really nice simple silver. If you want to spend more time on it, obviously you can add washes, with different colors to add different hues to make all of the metallics look more interesting. But again, this particular army is about the blue and it's about the helmets. For the chest eagle, I wanted to sit closely to what they did with the new box arts. I prefer a white chest piece, to be honest with you, when it comes to Ultramarines, but that's not what they've done in the new box art. They've got like this amber gold result going on. So for me, I painted it with scale 75 Amber Alchemy, cover the whole thing. This particular paint doesn't cover particularly well, to be honest with you. So a couple of coats, thin it down a little bit with some water, and then you'll be absolutely fine. And it matches quite similar to what Games Workshop have done on their new box arts for these Terminators. So it does a job. As for the Crux Terminatus, I think that's what it's called. I've got no idea, I can't remember. As for the Crux Terminatus and the other little details on the model, these are painted grey in the box arts. I wanted to go with something a little bit different because I found it just a little bit dull. So in this case, I've gone with the Vallejo Game Color Ghost Grey. So this is a really, really bright grey. It's almost white. And I'm putting a solid base coat down on all of those details. Now, obviously, I'm painting this to a time frame. So the amount of time that you want to spend on these details is entirely up to you. But even when we're army painting for ourselves, it doesn't even matter. Like, we want to get armies finished. So we prioritize the amount of time that we want to for each individual detail. So for me, the majority of the time on this gets spent on the helmet and the armor and the weathering, because that's where the most important part of it is from an army standpoint. And the details basically just need to be painted nice and neatly. So with this, as I said, Vallejo Game Color Ghost Grey, we're going to put a solid base coat down for all of these details. Once all of those base coats are down, you could go over this with like a wash of Nuln Oil and it will do the job just as well. I always find Nuln Oil is just a little bit dull. It's a little bit boring. Same as I find Agrax Earthshade, as great as it is, can end up looking quite dirty. So when it came to the Aquila and when it came to the Crux Terminatus, the white areas, I've gone over with a mix of Games Workshop Nuln Oil and Games Workshop Druchii Violet. I've also done the same for all of the silver. You don't need to do this. I wanted to add a little bit more depth to it as well. And the black metal, this is where I said this is optional. I just wanted to add a little bit of color to it. And how many different colors you add to it will just give you different interest. If you use blue, it will look a lot colder. If you use purple, it's just a nice subtle result that goes with all of the blue armor. But again, it's entirely up to you. I wanted to add some color to the silver. I didn't do it on the helmet because it wasn't needed, but I did do it in the areas of the metallics that sit within the blue armor. Again, entirely your choice. But for all of these areas, as I said, it's a 50-50 mix of Nuln Oil and Druchii Violet. Next up, the blue armor. When you airbrush anything, and this is an opinion, so feel free to disagree and that's cool. But when you airbrush anything, in my opinion, the airbrush always makes it look a little bit washed out. So we need to add some depth to it and some richness. The way that I've done this is Games Workshop Shyish Purple contrast paint, thinned it down quite a lot with the flow medium from Games Workshop and water. So 1 part water, 1 part flow medium, and 1 part Shyish Purple. And the idea with this is I'm going over everything. If you go over the flat panels, that's fine. You just need to be aware that you need to control any puddles that you might have. The idea with this is we're just trying to add some depth to the blue. If you miss the odd puddle and you end up having like a coffee stain on it, don't panic. We can hide it in a little bit of weathering. But for the most part, the flat areas of like the shoulder pad, I would not cover those because you get this exact issue, which is why I'm doing it. You have to basically remove that contrast paint so it doesn't affect it. But that's what we did. Shyish Purple. Now what we're going in with is the Games Workshop Hoeth Blue. And what we're going to do is just put some edge highlights on. The amount of edge highlights you put on a model is entirely up to you. I put edge highlights. It really depends on the model. In this case, the edge highlights go nearly everywhere. We're putting a very subtle edge highlight of the Hoeth Blue first. The reason for this is it's going to give us some nice frame and definition to the armor. And that's really important with Space Marines. I appreciate not everyone's a fan of this, but what we need to think about again is readability. Make sure that your shapes are all clearly separated and it will look far better from a distance. And that's huge because we want it to look good from far away before it looks good from up close. So this is really important. Add the definition, add your first set of edge highlights of Hoeth Blue. This will clearly define everything and give us a nice result. If you don't like edge highlights, and if you're not a fan of just like having them everywhere, my suggestion would be is pick out the edge highlights that are relevant to the model. So pick out the edge highlights around the areas of focus, like the head. Pick out the edge highlights for the edges that are just facing upwards. That will be enough. You don't have to do an edge highlight everywhere. It's not required. You can have a great result without all of them, but you do need enough to separate the important panels. And to be fair, on Terminators, Space Marines in general, they're really blocky Marines, so it's probably a good idea to have them all over the place. Once you've gone around the whole thing, you should start having something that looks nice and clear. Then what you're going to do is you're going to push those edge highlights. So we have 2 sets of edge highlights. This is, once again, you'll notice that I'm using the same colors everywhere. Vallejo Game Color Ghost Grey mixed into the Hoeth Blue from Games Workshop. So this is basically a 50-50 mix of Games Workshop Hoeth Blue and Vallejo Game Color Ghost Grey. And all I'm doing is I'm picking out some edge highlights, right? I'm picking out the corners. I'm picking out the brightest points that are facing upwards. And I'm making those pop a little bit more. So where we have nice depth and value range within our armor panels, because we airbrush the Zenithal Prime and then put the cyan over the top of it, we're doing effectively the same thing with the edge highlights. We have darker edge highlights and brighter edge highlights. It adds a sense of depth and gives us this really interesting, nice result. Again, Pick the edges that you want to do. You don't have to do all of them, but you just need enough. Next up, this is the chipping part. So we need the result to match across the model. So if we've added scratches and chips to the helmet, because remember we've got those helmets are slightly damaged, we need that to continue across the model. Now, one way of doing this, and we've done it in the past, is where you use a sponge and you sponge on the model. You sponge on the chips. The problem with that is you can end up with a very over-the-top busy result. Like you get a heavily weathered model, and we don't really want that on this. So we're going in with the paintbrush, we're going in with the tip of the brush, and all we're doing, after I finish playing with those edge highlights that I forgot about, all we're doing is we're adding the odd scratch and the odd little dot. So we're literally just painting on like little dots and marks. And we're doing this first of all with the Hoeth Blue. So this is the first edge highlight color. And then with the second edge highlight color, which is what I'm doing here, this is the Hoeth Blue and the Ghost Grey mix. In the bright areas, I'm now adding a few more chips and marks. So it's just the odd dot, it's the odd scratch. And again, what we have is we have two different values, two different levels of brightness of highlights on the edges and the chips and scratches, and this gives us that sense of depth. So we're doing the same. The weathering is the same colors as the chips and scratches. Sorry, the weathering, the chips and scratches is the same values, the same colors as our edge highlights. And the minute we start really placing in these edge highlights with this Ghost Grey mix and the Hoeth Blue, it really starts to come together, like it really starts to pop. And that's what we want, remember, because this is an army piece. We want it to look at it from far away. We really want to understand what's happening with all the shapes, and we really want to have something nice and striking. Try not to do squiggly lines, right? You don't want squiggly lines. You want straight lines or solid marks. And what you can also do, you can see on the Power Fist, there's that big chunk of that Hoeth Blue and Ghost Grey mix. Those are going to be quite deep scratches in the end, and I'm going to do another one on the shoulder pads. You don't have to do these everywhere. I quite like one or two. I think it makes it quite interesting. But once you've done them, basically what we're going to do, same again with the same color as we used on the helmet, Games Workshop Rhinox Hide. Above those scratches, we're going to add in a little bit of Rhinox Hide. So what happens is that Hoeth Blue and Ghost Grey mix ends up looking like a little bit of a highlight of a deep scratch. So it's a nice simple way of doing it, but adds a little bit of visual interest, adds some variation in the scratches and marks, which is quite nice in my opinion. Again, this is all heavily opinion based. You might not like the weathered look, which is fair enough. After that, it's pretty much a case of gluing the head on, finishing off the little details, and this is what we have. Nice Ultramarines Terminator. It's a really good tabletop level, and I'd be curious to know what you think. So let me know what you think in the comments below, guys. Thank you everyone for watching. It means a huge amount. As always, if you want to join the community, make sure you check out the Discord. If you want to support the channel further, check out the members area or the Patreon. But hit the like button, hit subscribe, and come hang out. Thanks everyone for watching. It means a huge amount. Cheers.